Hi, everyone. I hope you're doing well. And we are back with another Soundtrap project. This one is aptly called Soundtrap Project number 2. So, if you check out your Google Classroom and you head over to day 7 under your assignments menu, under your classwork menu, you'll find that there's a slideshow and an assignment listed called Soundtrap Project number 2. So right here, you're going to see what it's going to end up looking like. It looks very similar to Soundtrap Project number 1 in quite a few ways. All right, you'll recall from going back to the assignment and maybe even reviewing the earlier video that I recorded that Soundtrap Project 1 was an exploratory project that had us looking in our loops menu, discovering what Soundtrap had to offer to us, and putting them into Soundtrap in really intentional ways using a bass loop, a guitar loop, a drum or a beat loop, and then a loop of your choice. Soundtrap Project number 2 is going to be a natural extension of that using an element of music that we're going to introduce today called form. All right. So the first thing you want to do is sign into Soundtrap, of course, using our Music First Classroom login, not just going straight to soundtrap.com, but actually going in through our Music First link. And then once you sign in, you can go up and click Software and then go over to Soundtrap. All right, and when you get in, of course, the first thing we want to do is we want to title this project Soundtrap Project 2. And then once you've done that, be sure to click that Save button. That'll just right away prevent us from forgetting to name it the proper thing so that when it's time for grading, there can be less confusion about what project is what. All right. So before we get started, let's take a look at some background knowledge that we need to before we get this project underway. So like I said, there's a new element of music that we need to get underneath our belts in order to understand what we're doing in Soundtrap Project number 2, and that is the element of form in music. All right. So I've got a couple slides underneath the day 7 slideshow that talk about form. It's the organization of music, and it relates to how different parts of a song or a piece of music are put together. So far, we've talked about form through the lenses of verses, choruses, and bridges in music. So I know many of you listen to popular music, and you have your own favorite artists out there. And many of you can easily identify what a verse is, what a chorus is, and what a bridge is in music. All right. But when we expand our musical knowledge and when we start composing in the environment of a DAW or a digital audio workstation, we can look at form in some different ways. All right. We put it together like building blocks. So, like I said, it's the organization of music into distinct sections, and it helps us to understand, organize, and process music as we compose. It gives us a structure to be able to compose into. All right. And we can develop creatively within that structure. All right. So I'll talk about these last couple bullet points in just a moment. But if I go in and I look at my project, I notice right here that I have 2 main sections. All right. I have 2 sections. So I've assembled each of these sections in the same manner in which I assembled Soundtrap Project 1. So if you look over here into my blue loops, and I'll show you how to color code these in just a minute. I like things really organized by color, so I chose blue and green to organize my sections. So if I look over here to my first section, I've got a bass loop, I've got a guitar loop, I've got a beat right down here, and then I've chosen this sound effect right here as my 4 loops, the same requirements that I had in Soundtrap Project number 1. But taking a look, after I've finished my 8 measures and I move on to my 9th measure, I have a brand new section of music, a completely different section that I've begun in measure 9, and I've let go for another 8 measures right here. All right. So we're going to start right away by just letting you listen to what I've assembled and what I've composed right here. Not so bad for a middle school teacher, huh? Okay, here comes my big transition moment. Yeah, so it's something completely different. It contrasts nicely. So I very intentionally made a second section that was in very contrasting style to what I had in my first section. But again, still using a bass, a guitar, a beat, and then some sort of a choice loop. And I do think it's worth mentioning that both of my choice loops came out of the sound effects menu. All right, I know many of you really enjoyed your time searching through the various sound effects, but I want to really just emphasize that there are ways that we can really logically use those sound effects musically, and I hope that I've demonstrated that here. Okay, so repeated passages in sections are naturally emphasized whenever we have form. So if I were to go back and repeat one of those sections, you would easily remember that. And you would say, oh, this is a repeated section. This is something that's really important. While new material is easier to identify. So let's go back to our example back here in form when we talked about verses, choruses, and bridges. All right. The way that that really exemplifies form is when I'm listening to a song in popular music or any other type of music, I hear a verse to start out with. I'm listening to some sort of a singer tell me some sort of a story. All right. They're really laying down the groundwork. And it generally builds up into a chorus, which is like your main hook of the song. Now, one of the big difference between a verse and a chorus is that a chorus tends to repeat itself over the course of a song. If I were to say to you, sing She Will Be Loved by Maroon 5, you would start singing, I don't mind spending every day out on the corner. All right, because that's the chorus of the song. That's a part that comes back over and over and over again. All right. So my whole point in saying that repeated passages are naturally emphasized is because you hear them enough times. While the new material, the stuff that appears in verses and even in bridges, is really emphasized because it doesn't repeat. Okay. And in Soundtrap, I put down here, it's worth mentioning that form takes on a naturally visible element. And we mentioned that a second ago. We can tell where each section is here as we're composing, as we compose music. All right. So let's take a look at what our project requirements are. All right. We're going to create a 16 measure composition, which I've done here. And again, I'm going to hide my screen. Whoops. I'm going to hide my screen right here. Sorry about that. And I'm going to zoom in. Oops. It's probably a little too much zoom right there. So I'm going to zoom in and I'm going to really notice how I know that it's 16 measures because my loops are stretched out all the way till the 17. Just a simple reminder here that these numbers that appear in the measures, they appear at the beginning of the measures. All right. I know a lot of people like to look at these and assume that they're the end of the measure, but they are the beginning of the measure. Okay. So I'm going to zoom back out, bring myself back to the beginning, and I am going to restart my webcam so that I can maintain eye contact with you. All right. So I've got my 16 measures right here. So that's worth 1 point. 2 drums loops that change at measure 9. Same thing with the bass, the guitar, and the choice. All right. And what I mean by that is in your 9th measure right here, that's where your second section is going to start. So each of these that appears right here is 8 measures long, and it starts in measure 9. And then finally, an automatic change of volume leading into measure 9. And this is what I have to show you today. This is sort of your new Soundtrap technique for this project right here. So if we're going to go into a second section right here, if we're going to move from this first section, which by the way, when we work with form, we label sections using letter names. So this first section right here, I would call A. All right, obviously the first letter of the alphabet. In this second section, because it's distinctly different from my A section, I'm going to call it B. Now, if I were to have copied and pasted or simply inserted the same exact loops starting at measure 9 and going until measure 17, and it was an A section just repeated, that would be A. But right now, because I have something totally different in my second section, I can say that this is called A-B form. All right. So if I were to say compose a 16 measure composition in A-B form, you would know right away that it needs to be 16 measures long. And I have to have 2 distinct sections, one called my A section and one called my B section. But going back to what I was talking about earlier, the automatic change of volume, Soundtrap gives you the capability of programming different things to happen. All right. Now, we talked earlier about these track heads right here, how they're sort of like your mission control for each of the tracks that moves across. All right. So I have a volume function right here that I can manipulate by moving it up and down. But that volume section is just going to give me one volume that's going to follow the loop throughout the course of the track. Now, if I wanted to program a volume change to occur at a very specific moment, I would use a feature in Soundtrap called automation. All right. So what's the project parameter? I need an automatic change of volume leading into measure 9. All right. Because if I'm going to change musical sections, I want something musical to happen. I want to use my inner musicianship to say, okay, I need to get either louder or softer as I move into measure 9. So that's a decision that I want you to make. All right. You can either program an increase in volume or a crescendo, as we call it in music, or a decrease in volume, decrescendo, as we call it in music. All right. Because I want some excitement moving into my second section, my B section, I'm going to choose to crescendo into the B section. So I'm going to program an increase in volume. Now, how do I do this? All right. So we've talked about what some of these functions mean over in our track head, and I'm going to go to this zigzag key. Okay, kind of looks like a zigzag, and it says show and hide automation. So I'm going to press on that. Then I'm going to add an automation. And Soundtrap gives us 3 different options for automations. All right, and I'm going to come down to volume. All right, so I'm going to come down here, and look what happens. I get a horizontal line right here that runs the course of the entire track. And that horizontal line is going to be my map or my guide to how loud and how soft my volume is. All right. So the way that I can manipulate this line is by clicking on it. And when I click on it, I get various dots that move across the screen. All right. And these dots are the ways in which I can pull my horizontal line up. So you can put as many of these dots right on the screen as you'd like, however many you'd like to make you feel comfortable. All right. I find sometimes if I put too many dots, I tend to lose just a little bit of control over my ability to increase my volume. So if I take a look at this right here, I can see that I'm going to start out really soft, maybe down even into nothing, and I'm going to have a gradual crescendo or increase in volume throughout the course of where my horizontal line increases at this point or inclines at this point. Now, to toggle myself out of the automation, I'm just going to click this again. Let me solo my track to see if I can hear that change in volume. Let's see. Yeah, you can hear it's getting louder gradually. That's great. All right. Now, there are other functions in Soundtrap that I can use to fade in and fade out. But number one, those really give a whole lot of emphasis to the very beginning or the very end of each of your loops or each of your audio regions. And also, this allows us to really manually manipulate that sound. And I want you to get used to that as well. All right. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to do the same thing for all 4 of my loops. All right. Let me just do this really quickly for you. Bring this up. Whoops, that was probably a little bit too much. I want to try to mirror the incline that I have in my top loop right here. And I'm going to do this for all 4 of my loops. And it may seem a little tedious at first, but it's really great practice to get you to be able to practice your automation skills. And again, we want to think like musicians. We want to think look at that. That's a little bit, yeah. There we go. So we want to think like musicians, and we want to think, it's one thing to have a transition in music, but it's another one to change our volume in music as well. I'm going to bring some of these down just a bit so that I have some room to grow. And it's a really good lesson in patience and understanding that these things take time. Okay. Move that up. Great. And finally, I'm on my last one here, automation and volume. Move this one down. Here we go. Almost there. Thanks so much for hanging in there. Really appreciate it. Okay. So one of the great things is when I come and I take a look at this, I can see each of my crescendos. I can see each of my lines that are inclining up. All right. Now, of course, I'm going to click save. Remember, save often. And I'm going to come back to the beginning. And let's see what this whole thing sounds like with my change of volume leading into measure 9. Yeah, that sounds really good. Great. Now, just to remind you, if I want to change the volume of any loop or any track and not have it work under the auspices of automation, I can always come down here and I can change using this volume dial. My bass, for instance, I think in the second section can be turned up a bit. All right, yeah. So those are also some little adjustments that you can make as you go. And of course, I'm going to click save All right. So, in a nutshell, that is Soundtrap Project number 2. So, if you have any questions, let me know. And again, this is listed in your Google Classroom under Day 7, Soundtrap Project 2. Thanks so much for watching this video. Happy composing.